He burned her father's empire to the ground, then discovered the woman he'd taken prisoner was the stranger who had once saved his life. If you've ever believed that vengeance is the only language power understands, stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain came down like it had a grievance, not the soft kind that soaks into the earth quietly and disappears. This was Chicago rain, mean and horizontal, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck and reminded you that the city had never once promised you comfort. It hammered the asphalt on South Wacker and pooled in the cracked gutters along the Riverwalk and made the orange glow of street lamps bleed across wet pavement like something wounded. Cassian Voss stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 43rd floor and watched it all come apart below him. He was 36 years old and looked 10 years older in the glass's reflection. Not from softness, the opposite. His face had been carved into something severe by a decade of decisions that left marks you couldn't treat with sleep. The jaw was hard, the eyes were harder, and the dark circles beneath them weren't from exhaustion so much as from the particular kind of sleeplessness that comes when the thing you're planning is large enough to keep the brain burning at 3 a.m. He held a phone in his right hand. The screen had gone dark. He didn't unlock it. Behind him, a man named Decker sat at a long steel table covered in printed satellite images, surveillance photographs, and handwritten logistics grids. Decker was 51, built like a man who had spent his 20s moving cargo containers by hand, and his loyalty to Cassian Voss was the only ideology he had ever believed in. He was the kind of man who didn't offer opinions unless invited. Tonight, he had been silent for 11 minutes. Cassian finally spoke. "Tell me the timing again." Decker didn't look up from the table. "Strike team's position at 2:45. The dockside warehouse goes first, thermite charges on the structural columns. The distribution hub on Cermak follows at 3. The money laundering front on Michigan goes dark at 3:15. By 4 a.m., Marcus Marlowe has no revenue, no storage, no mechanism to move product, and no illusion that he still controls anything inside this city." Cassian turned from the window. "And the man himself. Slip the surveillance net around 10 p.m. We're tracking 3 possible vehicles. If he runs to ground before we can, he'll run." Cassian set the phone on the table without looking at the satellite images. "He always runs. Marcus Marlowe has survived 20 years in this business because he is very good at not being present when consequences arrive." Decker finally looked up. "Then we take what we can." "We take everything." Cassian pulled on a dark jacket, unhurried. "And then we wait for him to surface." He walked toward the door, and Decker rose from the table, already reaching for his radio. "Cassian," he stopped. "Your brother's been dead 48 hours. The medical examiner is calling it I know what they're calling it." His voice had no heat in it at all, which was more frightening than anger. "Marcus Marlowe put a man inside a parking structure on the north side and had my brother shot twice in the back of the head. I know this because the man who did it is currently unconscious in the basement of this building and spent most of tonight confirming details he was extremely reluctant to share." He paused with his hand on the doorframe. "I am not grieving, Decker. I am working." He left without another word. The fire started at 2:48 a.m. and burned with the particular totality that only thermite achieves. Not dramatic, not explosive, just absolute. The warehouse on the dockside collapsed inward within 14 minutes, the internal temperature so extreme that the sprinkler systems converted to steam before they could function. The distribution hub on Cermak went cleaner, the charges placed along load-bearing walls with enough precision that the adjacent residential building registered only a tremor. The Michigan front was the fastest. A single operative with a laptop in 6 minutes dismantled the financial architecture before the physical structure followed. By 4:10 a.m., Marcus Marlowe's empire in Chicago was functionally ash. By 4:40, the man himself had vanished from every channel Cassian's network had the capacity to monitor. What they found instead, at a small apartment in Wicker Park, 3rd floor, corner unit, bookcase in the living room overflowing half-finished canvas on an easel near the window, was his daughter, Beth. Her name was Elena Marlowe, and she was 27 years old, and she was asleep when they came through the door. The entry team was professional. No unnecessary force, no shouting, no chaos for its own sake. Cassian had given explicit instructions. She was not to be harmed. She was not to be terrorized beyond the unavoidable reality of the situation. She was a means to an end, not an end herself. She didn't scream when they woke her. That surprised the man who pulled the blackout hood over her head. He had done this 11 times in his career. People always made noise, but it was involuntary, biological, the body's protest against the sudden deletion of the world. Elena Marlowe made a sharp, involuntary inhale, and then she went very still. Still in the way that suggested she was thinking rather than freezing. They drove for 40 minutes through rain-soaked streets and brought her into what had once been a Gothic stone cathedral on the city's near west side. A century-old structure the Voss organization had purchased through a shell company 3 years prior, gutted the interior to raw stone and steel, and converted into a compound that was simultaneously fortified and invisible. The kind of place that looked like an architectural restoration project to anyone passing on the street. They put her in a room on the second floor. Stone walls. High, narrow windows that let in gray pre-dawn light, but nothing else. A cot, a blanket, a chair, a steel door. A bathroom with a bolted partition. Nothing she could use as a weapon, because the men who had prepared the room knew their business. They took the hood off. Elena Marlowe stood in the middle of the room and looked at it the way someone might assess a new office, methodical, unsentimental, already identifying dimensions. She was not beautiful in any conventional arranged sense. She was striking in the way that raw attention always is. Her face carried intelligence the way some faces carry bone structure, not a decoration, but a function. Dark hair in a loose braid that had partially unraveled during the abduction, a worn university sweatshirt over flannel pants. No shoes. She was still holding the book she'd apparently grabbed automatically on her way out of bed, and she looked down at it once, as if surprised to find it in her hand, and set it carefully on the cot. Then she turned and faced the steel door and waited. Cassian came at 7 a.m. He hadn't slept. He didn't particularly intend to. He'd spent the intervening hours on logistics calls, managing the fallout from the night's operations, receiving reports from attorneys, and sitting for 40 silent minutes in the room where his brother's personal effects had been boxed and stacked against a wall. Not going through them, just sitting in proximity to them, the way you sometimes need to be near a thing to convince yourself it's real. He came into her room without knocking. He pulled the single chair away from the wall and sat down, 6 feet from where she stood, and looked at her. She looked back. "You know who I am," he said. Not a question. Cassian Voss. Her voice was steadier than it should have been, lower than he'd expected. "Your father was Raymond Voss. You've run the organization since he had the stroke 4 years ago. Your brother was named Daniel." A brief pause. "I'm sorry about Daniel." Something moved through his expression and was gone. "Your sincerity is noted." "I'm not performing sincerity. I'm acknowledging that you lost someone and that it clearly matters to you, which suggests you're capable of loss, which suggests you might be capable of reason." She kept her eyes on his face without aggression or submission, just an even, direct attention. "I had nothing to do with my father's business. I haven't lived in the same city as my father in 6 years. I am a graduate student studying conservation of oil paintings. I am specifically, at this moment, 6 weeks from finishing a thesis on Renaissance altarpiece restoration that I have spent 2 years writing." She paused. "I need you to understand that I understand why I'm here, and I need you to understand that I cannot give you what you're looking for." Cassian said nothing. "I don't know where he is," she said. "I don't know how to reach him. I receive an email approximately every 3 months from an anonymous address that contains 3 sentences about how he is well and thinking of me. I don't respond. I made a decision at 21 to have no relationship with Marcus Marlowe, and I have honored that decision." She looked at him with the kind of clarity that is more unsettling than anger. "So I understand that I'm leverage. I understand that you believe my presence will draw him out. I am telling you, as honestly as I know how to tell you anything, that it probably won't, because my father has made a career of calculating what things cost before he chooses whether to pay. Cassian studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, replaced the chair against the wall, and moved toward the door. "There are books on the shelf in the hallway," he said, without turning around. "My men will bring you what you ask for within reason. You won't be mistreated." "That's not comfort," she said. "That's just a lower category of wrong." He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. She watched the muscles in his shoulders shift. A very slight tension, there and gone. "No," he said. "It isn't." He left. The days that followed had a particular texture to them, the texture of time being spent rather than lived. Elena organized herself. She had always been good at organization in constrained circumstances. At 9 years old, when her parents' marriage had been disintegrating along lines she couldn't see but could feel in the barometric pressure of every room, she had begun keeping notebooks. At 15, when she'd understood enough about her father's business to be afraid without knowing exactly what she was afraid of, she had taught herself to restore calm through structure, taking any closed system, understanding its components, and moving through them methodically. In the stone room, she worked through the contents of her memory the way an archaeologist works a site. She reconstructed, detail by detail, the Ghent altarpiece, all 12 panels, every figure, the lamb at the altar with the blood streaming into the chalice, the attending angels with their instruments, the landscape in the background with its impossible specificity. She spent 4 hours on the trees alone, remembering the silver birches in the lower register and then arguing with herself about whether they were birches or something else, pulling up every image she had ever studied of the work, cross-referencing. When she lost track of a detail, she didn't allow herself frustration. She noted the gap and moved past it. She slept when her body demanded it. She ate what they brought, because maintaining physical function was not optional if she intended to survive this with her cognition intact. She did not allow herself to think about the thesis in terms of the 6 weeks she had already begun calculating she might lose. She did not allow herself the particular luxury of imagining how this ended badly. She allowed herself, in the very early hours of the third morning, to be briefly and wholly terrified. 10 minutes of it, controlled, the way you might drain a wound, and then she put it away. The only variable she could not account for was Cassian Voss himself. He came every day, sometimes twice. He didn't always speak immediately. He would sit in the chair across from wherever she had positioned herself, floor, cot, the narrow strip of morning light below the window. And he would watch her the way someone watches a thing they are trying to categorize and finding insufficient categories for. He asked questions sometimes, not interrogation questions about her father, though those came too. He asked her once what she was thinking about, and she told him she was arguing with herself about Flemish painting technique circa 1430, and he asked why it mattered, and she said because precision mattered, and he said that was something he understood. On the 5th day, she asked him why he had really come in that morning. He looked at her steadily for a moment, then, "I wanted to see if you'd broken." "And?" "You haven't." "Does that disappoint you?" "No?" He said it without hesitation. "I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who would do anything to avoid pain. It gets claustrophobic." She looked at him. "You didn't want an arrogant man's daughter. You wanted a hostage who'd perform distress and cooperate." "I wanted a lever," he said, with the flat honesty of a man who'd stopped maintaining comfortable fictions. "You're not shaped like one." "People rarely are." He studied her face. "Your father has sent 2 encrypted communications in 5 days. Both times he offered money. He offered connections to federal witnesses. He offered everything except himself." Elena said nothing. Her jaw moved once, something she had been carrying with her since the age of 15 and had learned to contain. "You're not surprised," Cassian said. "No." Her voice was very quiet. "I am not surprised." He left without any further word, and there was something in the way he closed the door, not gently, not roughly, but with a kind of deliberate control that told her the information about her father had landed somewhere it hadn't expected to land. The assault came on the 7th night. It came the way violence at that scale always comes when it's organized. Not announced, but suddenly and completely present, as if the world had simply decided to reconfigure. Elena was awake. She had been unable to sleep, sitting on the stone floor with her back against the wall below the window, working through a problem in the Ghent altarpiece she'd been stuck on for 2 days. The specific way the light fell in the upper register of the diasis panel, whether the original painter had used lead white or a chalk ground for the highlights. The first explosion was distant, below and to the east, somewhere in the structure's lower level. Not cinematic, not thunderous, more like the building clearing its throat. Then the second, closer, and the stone floor transmitted a vibration through the wall into her spine that told her this was structural. She was on her feet before the sound finished. The gunfire started 30 seconds later. Not the sporadic kind, sustained, multiple sources, the acoustic signature of an organized tactical approach from outside the building. She could hear voices in the corridor beyond the steel door, sharp and urgent, and then boots moving fast, and then a sound she recognized from no prior experience but understood instinctively, a sound like air being reorganized suddenly, that was close enough to rattle the light fixture in the ceiling. She moved to the door, locked, as always. She moved to the wall beside the door instead, because if the door came in fast, the wall beside it was the survivable position. 3 minutes of sustained chaos. Then the steel door opened, not the way it had opened every other day. It came in hard, driven by something other than a key, and the man who fell through it was not one of Cassian's regular rotation of guards. He was wearing different gear, tactical black with a red patch on the left shoulder she didn't recognize. And he was armed and already raising the weapon, and she did 2 things simultaneously that she had no conscious blueprint for. She drove the heel of her hand upward into his nose, which was closer to her than any weapon, and she used his forward momentum to redirect him into the wall, and then she ran. The corridor was smoke-filled and lit by emergency lighting, red-orange and inadequate. She moved by wall contact, hands to stone, heading instinctively away from the gunfire that was loudest to her right. 40 feet, an intersection. Left or right or straight, no information, so she went straight because straight was the longest sight line and she could see 10 feet ahead before darkness swallowed it. She almost ran into Cassian Voss coming the other direction. He was bleeding, a lot. Left side, below the ribs. His jacket was dark with it, hand pressed against it, and his face had the particular grayish quality of someone operating on adrenaline over significant blood loss. He had a weapon in his right hand, and his eyes, when they found her, did something she couldn't fully read. Relief and anger, and a strange, acute attention, all simultaneous. "Why aren't you gone?" he said. "Which way out did you expect me to know?" she said. "You're bleeding badly." "I'm aware." "Through the wall or through?" "Through what?" "Through the injury. Is it through and through, or is it still in you?" He stared at her for 1 second. "Still in." "Then you can't run far." And she grabbed his arm, his right arm, not the side with the injury, and pulled. "Where's the nearest defensible room that is not on the ground floor?" "East corridor, second door." "Move!" He moved. They moved together, her pace calibrating to his without discussion, and she kept pressure on his left side with her free hand, even though the angle was wrong and she was probably making it worse. And she couldn't help that because keeping him conscious was the priority over keeping him sterile. He directed her with single-word instructions. Left, stop, here. And they got through a heavy door into what appeared to be a maintenance room. Stone walls, metal shelving, a fuse panel, no windows. She got him down against the wall. He was still holding the weapon. She didn't try to take it. "You don't have to be here," he said. The voice was strained now. "The exterior east wall is compromised. You can get out." "I know." She was already using the hem of her sweatshirt to pack against the entry wound with enough pressure to do something, maybe, if she was lucky. "You need to stay awake." "You could go." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I'm not the kind of person who leaves someone to bleed out in a utility closet." She looked up at him. "Even if they're the person who had me abducted, the math still doesn't work out to leaving." He looked at her in the red emergency light. His face had shed all its architecture of control. Not weak, not diminished, just exposed in the way that people only become exposed when the blood loss crosses a certain threshold, and maintaining the face becomes a luxury the body can't afford. And then he said very quietly, "Your necklace." She looked at him. Her hand went to her collarbone, the thin silver chain, old, with a small asymmetric clasp she'd never gotten repaired. "Where did you get it?" he said. She frowned. "I've had it for years. I found it on a—" "New York." His voice was dropping. "West 34th, behind the subway entrance. Winter, 7 years ago." Her frown shifted into something else. "There was a man," she said slowly, "behind the entrance to the station. It was maybe 2 in the morning. He'd been—" She stopped. "He was losing a lot of blood. I stayed with him until he could tell me a number to call, and I called it, and I left before anyone came because I didn't—" She stopped again. Cassian Voss was looking at her with the eyes of someone who had just watched a map of the universe rearrange itself into an entirely different shape. "You lost the necklace," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "When I moved you, I found it after." He said nothing. His eyes stayed on her face. "You're the man from the subway," she said. The voices in the corridor were getting closer. Somewhere above them, something else was burning. His blood was warm and dark against her hands, and the emergency lights pulsed once and held. And Elena Marlowe stared at the man who had destroyed her father's empire and stolen her from her apartment and held her in a stone room for 7 days, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only in moments too strange for the ordinary mind to process, that she had already once refused to let him die. She pressed harder against the wound. "Stay awake," she said. "The people coming for you had better be yours." Outside the door, boots hit stone in a pattern that was either rescue or the end of everything, and there was no way to know which until the handle turned. The handle turned. The door came in fast, and the first man through it had his weapon up and his eyes were scanning the room the way trained eyes do, floor to corners to threats. And Elena felt Cassian tense against her hand with the particular coiling that precedes either fighting or dying. And then the man said, "Boss," in a voice that broke at the edges with something close to relief, and Cassian exhaled once, slow and controlled, and the weapon in his hand lowered 2 inches. Decker came through behind the first man. He took in the room in one sweep. The blood, Elena's hands pressed against Cassian's side, the emergency lighting making everything the color of old wounds. And his face did something complex that it immediately shut down. "How bad?" he said. "It's in there," Cassian said. "Then we move now." Decker looked at Elena for 1 beat, and the look was not hostile and not warm. It was the look of a man filing information for later use. "Let him lean on you. Left side. Keep the pressure." "I know," she said. They moved through the east corridor and out through a loading bay that had been secured by Cassian's men in the last 12 minutes. She could tell from the spent casings on the concrete and the 2 bodies that had been moved against the far wall with the particular deliberateness of men who clean up after themselves even under fire. The rain was still coming down outside. She felt it on her face and arms, and it was so shockingly ordinary after 7 days of stone walls that she almost stopped moving. Cassian's weight shifted against her shoulder, and she adjusted her grip on his arm without thinking. "Don't stop," he said. "I'm not stopping." 3 vehicles were running in the alley. She was put into the second one with Cassian, and Decker got in front, and they moved immediately, no waiting, the kind of departure that had been planned against exactly this contingency. They drove for 25 minutes and arrived at a secondary location, a converted industrial building in a neighborhood that felt like the city's back teeth, residential on its skin but hollow underneath. She was brought into a room that was warmer than the cathedral, with actual furniture and actual lighting, and 2 men she hadn't seen before appeared with a field kit that was considerably more substantial than anything she'd managed with her sweatshirt. She was moved to the adjacent room. She sat on a wooden chair and looked at her hands, which were dark with Cassian's blood, and someone handed her a towel that she used without comment. Decker came in 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You didn't run," he said. "We covered this with your boss. I want to hear it from you." She looked up at him. "I'm not going to perform my reasons for your benefit. I stayed because I stayed. What happens now?" Decker studied her. He was the kind of man who had spent decades reading people as a survival mechanism, and she could feel him doing it, the specific weight of that attention, looking for the angle. "You saved his life. I kept pressure on a wound and stayed awake. Let's not make it mythological. He's going to be out for several hours. There's a doctor with him." He paused. You're not going back to the room at the cathedral. Because the cathedral is compromised. Yes. So where am I? Still here. Just differently here. He uncrossed his arms. You want coffee? She looked at her bloodied hands. Yes. She learned things in the hours that followed, not because anyone told her, but because she was observant, and the building was not perfectly partitioned. She learned that the assault on the cathedral had been conducted by men affiliated with a cartel operating out of the Southwest. Not Marlowe's people, something separate, something that had apparently been waiting for the Voss organization to be weakened by the war with Marlowe before moving. She learned this from 2 conversations that passed within earshot of the room where she sat, and from the way Decker's jaw set when he made his 3rd phone call in 30 minutes, and from the name she heard twice through the wall, Reyes, delivered each time with the specific emphasis people use for names that mean something they'd rather not have to explain. She also learned that Cassian's brother had been carrying something. She learned this because a man came into the adjacent space carrying a sealed hard case and spoke to another man in a voice that was calibrated for privacy but not sufficiently, and she heard the phrase Daniel's files before the door was shut. She sat with that. Cassian came back to consciousness at 4 in the afternoon. She knew because she heard his voice through the wall. Clipped, immediate, oriented, demanding a status report within what sounded like 30 seconds of waking up. She heard Decker's voice in response. She heard Cassian say her name once, a question, and Decker's answer. 15 minutes later, Decker opened her door. He wants to see you. She followed him down a short corridor and into a larger room where Cassian was sitting upright on a cot, back against the wall, with the particular stillness of a man who is working extremely hard to present as less damaged than he is. He was shirtless, and the bandaging on his left side was tight and professional and already showing the faint bloom of seepage at its edge. His face was the color of old concrete. He looked at her with those eyes that didn't perform anything. You stayed, he said. Your man already asked me about that. Decker asks everything. I'm asking now. She sat down in the chair someone had placed across from him. I told you why. You said the math didn't work out. He watched her. What's the rest of it? There isn't a rest of it. There's always a rest of it. She met his gaze directly. The man in the subway. I didn't know who he was. I stayed with him for 40 minutes in the middle of the night in a neighborhood I had no business being in because leaving someone to die on concrete when you have the option to do otherwise isn't a neutral act. It's a choice. I made the same choice last night. The identity of the person didn't change the arithmetic. She paused. It changes other things, but not that particular calculation. Cassian was quiet for a moment. 7 years ago, I was 29 and running point on an operation in New York that went wrong in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was left by people I trusted in an alley behind a subway entrance with 2 broken ribs and a knife wound that nicked something it shouldn't have nicked. My phone was gone. I was lying on wet concrete calculating the odds, and they weren't good. He stopped. And then there was a woman with a silver necklace who sat down on the ground next to me and asked me what number to call. You told me a number. I told you a number. I called it and someone picked up in half a ring and I said where you were, and then I waited until I could hear a car coming and I left. Why did you leave before they arrived? She considered him, because whoever was coming to that number was in the same business as whoever had done that to you, and I was 20 years old and I had spent my whole life trying not to be adjacent to that particular business. She looked at him steadily. I found your necklace where you'd been lying. I kept it because I wasn't sure why, and then I kept it too long to return it, and then it became mine. I didn't know it was yours. A silence stretched between them that had a different quality than the silences of the previous 7 days. Your father, he said finally. He reached out again this morning. Her face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. He offered, Cassian said, to provide the names and locations of 3 federal witnesses currently under protection in exchange for your release. He watched her absorb this. Not himself. 3 strangers. Elena said nothing. The thing she had been containing since she was 15, the specific weight of understanding who her father was, moved behind her eyes and then was still. He bargained human lives, she said. Flat, not a question. Yes. She looked at the floor, then back at him. What did you do with the offer? I rejected it. He watched her. I have no use for federal witnesses. What I want is Marcus Marlowe. He's not going to trade himself. I told you that in the first hour. I know. Cassian shifted his weight against the wall, and the movement cost him something he absorbed without showing it. What I'm beginning to reconsider is whether what I want is actually the right thing to be wanting. She looked at him sharply. Your brother, she said. You're certain it was my father. I was certain. The particular emphasis on the past tense was deliberate. The man in my basement told me it was Marlowe's order. He was very convincing. People in that situation usually are. Yes. His voice was even. And they also sometimes say whatever produces the outcome they need. He looked at the wall. Decker found a discrepancy this morning. The man who died, who I believed was my brother, the identification was made by two people. One of them has worked for me for 11 years. The other has worked for me for 3. He stopped. The one who has worked for me for 3 years made the identification first. The other confirmed it. She understood what he was telling her. She had the kind of intelligence that moved fast when given raw material. You're saying you may have been pointed. I'm saying the possibility has now occurred to me. Yes. If someone pointed you at my father's empire, she stopped herself, working through it. If it wasn't my father's order, then your brother's death was the mechanism, the trigger. Someone needed you to burn Marlowe's organization down, and they used Daniel to make you do it. Cassian's jaw set so hard she could see the muscle working. That is one reading, he said. Do you have another one? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Decker came in 20 minutes later with the hard case she had seen earlier. He set it on the table without ceremony, and the look that passed between him and Cassian was the kind that carries weight accumulated over years. Not warm, not cold, but load-bearing. Daniel's files, Cassian said. He was looking at the case, not at her. The encryption keys came through an hour ago. Decker glanced at Elena. She stays or goes? Cassian looked at her. The question was real. She could see him actually asking it, not performing the asking. I'm a graduate student, she said. I spend my professional life analyzing documents in 4 languages. I have no loyalty to my father, and I have every reason to want to understand what's actually happening. She paused. But it's your call. He looked at Decker. Decker shrugged, which for Decker was apparently equivalent to a detailed endorsement. Open it, Cassian said. The files inside were Daniel Voss's. Not operational files, not cartel logistics, but something that looked at first pass like personal research, dates going back nearly 2 years, names she didn't recognize, shipping manifests, a corporate structure chart for something called Meridian Atlantic Holdings that branched into subsidiary after subsidiary like a root system designed to be impossible to follow. Elena leaned over the table. She had been still for 7 days in a stone room with nothing but her own mind for tools, and it had sharpened her to something near uncomfortable. This company, she said, Meridian Atlantic. Daniel was tracking it for 8 months, Cassian said from across the room. We don't know why. I do. She turned 2 pages, then 3, and found the page she had intuited was there, a shipping route map, East Coast ports, with dates and cargo manifests that didn't match the declared goods. This is the pattern for a specific kind of logistics fraud. The cargo weight discrepancies between departure and arrival manifests, the shell company layering, the port authority relationships. She stopped. My father used a version of this structure in the mid-2000s, before he moved to direct distribution. I saw documents once when I was in high school that I wasn't supposed to see. She looked up. But this isn't my father's operation. The structure is similar, but the scale is, this is 10 times larger, 20 times. And the port relationships are federal. These aren't local officials. These are... She turned another page and stopped. Cassian was watching her. These are federal insiders, she said. This is a network moving cargo through federally supervised ports with federally connected protection. She set the page down carefully. Your brother wasn't tracking a business competitor. He was tracking a criminal infrastructure that operates above the level of either your family or mine. The room was very quiet. Then, whoever killed him, Decker said, his voice flat, didn't kill him because of the Marlowe War. No, Elena said. They killed him because of this. Yes. She looked at Cassian. He had gone very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but its precise opposite. The stillness of a structure under maximum load. His face was doing nothing at all, which meant everything was happening underneath it. Someone inside your organization knew what Daniel had found, Elena said carefully, and they killed him and made it look like Marlowe, because they needed your war to happen. They needed Marlowe's empire destroyed or destabilized. Because Marlowe knew about this network too, or was about to. She paused. Or because Marlowe was about to cooperate with someone who could use what Daniel had found. Cassian said very quietly, who had access to Daniel's location the night he died? The question wasn't directed at her. It was directed inward, and she watched him work through it, and she watched the moment he arrived somewhere. Some specific name or face or memory, because his expression didn't change, but his breathing did, just once, a controlled exhale through the nose. Cassian, Decker said carefully. Who ran the security detail for Daniel that week? Cassian said. His voice was entirely flat now, the flatness of something stripped of all decoration. Decker didn't answer immediately. Decker. The rotation was set by the inner coordination team. Decker's voice was equally careful. Standard protocol. 3 men. Rotating 12-hour shifts. And who set the rotation? Silence. Who set the rotation? Decker picked up his phone. He looked at it. He set it back down with the deliberate care of a man who has just understood something that will cost him. The coordination schedule that week was managed out of your uncle's office. The words landed in the room with the particular density of things that cannot be unlanded. Elena looked at Cassian. His face was a closed system. He did not move. He did not blink. He sat with the information pressing into him from every angle, and he did not let anything happen on the outside of his body, and she understood that what she was watching was a man experiencing a specific kind of devastation. Not the explosive kind, not the kind that produces noise, but the interior kind, the kind that restructures something fundamental quietly, like a building whose foundation has shifted 2 inches and whose walls don't crack for another 3 months. Vincent Voss. She had heard the name twice in the files. She had noted it without context. She had context now. Your uncle, she said. Not accusing, just placing the word in the air. Cassian stood up from the cot. He shouldn't have. She could see the cost of it cross his face, but he stood. He put his shirt on slowly, with the movements of a man overriding significant physical protest. Get me a phone, he said to Decker. Cassian? A clean one. Now. Decker left. Cassian stood in the center of the room with his back to Elena, and she watched the line of his shoulders, the set of them, the lockdown tension that ran from the base of his neck to the wound in his side. And she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would matter. He turned around. His eyes found her and stayed there. And there was something in them she hadn't seen before in 7 days of daily visits to a stone room. Not softness, nothing so available as that, but a rawness, an exposure that the blood loss and the revelation had combined to strip from him without permission. My uncle taught me to drive, he said. He taught me to read a financial ledger. He came to every school event my parents missed, which was most of them. When my father had the stroke, it was my uncle who sat with me for 6 hours and told me what the organization would need from me and said he believed I could give it. He stopped. He gave the eulogy at my mother's funeral. Elena held his gaze. I know, she said. That's why it was him. Cassian stared at her. Someone who needed you pointed and moving in a specific direction couldn't use an enemy, she said. An enemy you'd question, an enemy you'd examine. It had to be the person whose word you'd never interrogate, because you had no architecture for doubting him. She paused. The people who built this network understood that. They chose their tool accordingly. Decker came back with a phone. Cassian took it without looking at him. He stood holding it, and Elena watched him understand that the thing he was about to do, whatever it was, could not be undone, and that he knew it, and that he was choosing to do it anyway. "What are you going to do?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then, "I need to reach your father." She blinked. "My father?" Whatever Marlowe knew about Meridian Atlantic, whatever he was sitting on that made him a target, I need it, and he's not going to send it to me in an encrypted file. He looked at the phone. He's going to need a reason to trust that this isn't a trap. He's going to need something I can offer that has actual value. He looked back at her. He's going to need to hear your voice. The room fell completely quiet. Elena sat with that for a full 5 seconds. The weight of what he was asking, the complexity of what it meant, the fact that she had spent 6 years building a life specifically structured around never being the instrument of her father's decisions. And here was a man who had destroyed everything Marcus Marlowe owned, who had put her in a stone room for a week, who had been shot protecting his people, and who was now asking her to call the man she had deliberately excised from her existence. She thought about the shipping manifests. She thought about Daniel Voss, 29 days dead, and what he had found. She thought about the specific scale of what was in those files, the cargo, the port relationships, the federal protection, and what it meant about how many people were moving through that network who hadn't chosen to. She held out her hand for the phone. Cassian gave it to her without a word. She dialed a number she had not dialed in 6 years, and she knew it by heart, which was its own kind of information about the nature of the things we claim to leave behind. And she put the phone to her ear, and it rang twice, and then a voice she recognized answered, careful, alert, already calculating. And she said, "It's me. Don't say my name. I'm with Cassian Voss, and we need 20 minutes, and what you tell him in those 20 minutes is going to matter more than anything you have ever decided in your life." And she held the phone out to Cassian, and their eyes met over the distance between them, and she understood that the moment she handed it across that distance, nothing about this situation would ever again be what it had been. She handed it across. He took it. And somewhere on the other end of a clean burner line, Marcus Marlowe began to talk. Marcus Marlowe talked for 19 minutes. He talked the way a man talks when he has been holding something for too long in a space too small, not with relief exactly, but with the controlled urgency of someone releasing pressure through a valve they've finally decided to open. His voice was even, precise, the voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where imprecision was a liability, and he did not waste words on apology or explanation of his absence from Elena's life, which told Cassian something about the man that the files had not. Cassian stood in the center of the room and listened. He asked 3 questions. The first 2 were clarifying. The third one stopped the conversation for 4 full seconds before Marlowe answered. When it was done, Cassian set the phone on the table face down. Elena watched him from the chair. She had been watching his back for most of the call, the set of his shoulders, the one moment where his hand had tightened on the phone until the knuckles shifted color, the way he had stood completely motionless when Marlowe said something in the 14th minute that she hadn't been able to hear clearly. "What did he tell you?" she said. Cassian pulled out the nearest chair and sat down across from her. He moved carefully, the wound enforcing a deliberateness his body wouldn't otherwise have allowed. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. A very brief moment, the kind a man allows himself when he needs to organize something before it can be spoken. "Meridian Atlantic Holdings," he said, "has been operational for 11 years. It moves cargo through 6 eastern seaboard ports under federal customs oversight that has been purchased specifically and deliberately through a network of political relationships that goes from port authority level up through 2 congressional offices." He paused. "The cargo isn't product, it isn't weapons, it's people." Elena's face went very still. "Your father has been building a file on Meridian Atlantic for 3 years, Cassian continued. He encountered them peripherally, a competing shipping contract, a port relationship he tried to develop that was already owned, and he started pulling the thread because Marcus Marlowe pulls every thread. What he found took him 18 months to fully understand, and once he understood it, he understood why understanding it was dangerous." He looked up at her. "He went to ground before I burned his operation, not because he was afraid of me. He went to ground because someone told him, 48 hours before the fires, that he had been identified by the people running Meridian Atlantic and that they were going to use my war with him as the mechanism to eliminate him." "Someone told him," she said. Who? Cassian's jaw moved. Vincent Voss. The name sat in the air between them. Elena leaned forward. Your uncle warned my father. My uncle, Cassian said, has been the Chicago side political liaison for Meridian Atlantic for 7 years. He built the local government relationships that protect their port access on Lake Michigan. He has received, across 11 years of financial records your father managed to obtain, approximately $42 million in payments routed through 4 different shell structures. He stopped. He warned your father to run because a dead Marcus Marlowe produces an investigation. A disappeared Marcus Marlowe produces nothing. He's a criminal, he runs, that's what they do. Vincent needed him gone, not martyred. But Daniel found the files. Daniel found the files. And Daniel told our uncle about them, because Daniel trusted Vincent the same way I trusted Vincent, and because Daniel was 26 years old and still believed that family was a fixed point. He said the last sentence with a quietness that was more devastating than volume. Vincent had him killed within 72 hours. Then he pointed me at your father because I was the most efficient weapon he had access to, and I was primed, and I was grieving, and grief makes people into instruments if you know how to hold them. Elena sat back in her chair. She was processing it the way she processed difficult things, not with visible emotion, but with an interior rearrangement, fitting new information against existing architecture, finding where the load-bearing walls had shifted. He's been watching you dismantle Marlowe's empire, she said, the whole time. And when the cartel attacked the cathedral, that was not coincidence. Cassian's voice was flat. The Reyes cartel has a port relationship with Meridian Atlantic on the Gulf side. Someone told them the Voss organization was weakened and distracted. Someone told them the timing. He looked at his hands again. I've been running my uncle's play from the beginning, and I didn't know it. Sid. Decker came back into the room 10 minutes later with 2 men Elena hadn't seen before. Younger, competent-looking, the kind of competent that comes from specific training rather than accumulated street experience. He set a laptop on the table and opened it without preamble. Marcus Marlowe's files are transmitting now, he said. He had them staged on a dead drop server with a time release protocol. Your conversation triggered the release. He looked at Cassian. It's everything, financial records, communication intercepts, identity documents for 6 of the major players, and he stopped, glanced at Elena, back to Cassian, and personnel files for every individual Meridian Atlantic has used in the Chicago political layer. Show me. Decker turned the laptop. Cassian leaned forward and read for 90 seconds. Elena watched his face, and it did nothing at all except for the muscles around his eyes, which tightened once and then held. He reached out and turned the laptop so she could see. The personnel file on the screen was detailed: photograph, biography, financial summary, communication records. The photograph showed a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the particular kind of face that projects trustworthiness, the way an architecture firm projects stability. A face she recognized from the 2 times she had seen it in old photographs in her father's house, a very long time ago. Beneath the photograph, the role designation read, Chicago Regional Coordinator, Political Infrastructure. Beneath that, a secondary notation that had been added in a different hand, apparently recently. Handler, Cassian Voss Asset Development, 2019 to present. She read that last line twice. Asset development, she said. It means, Cassian said, his voice completely uninflected, that my uncle has been managing me as an asset for Meridian Atlantic for at least 6 years. It means my organization, my resources, my relationships, my capacity for violence has been available to them as a tool. He paused. It means everything I thought I was building for them. The room was very quiet. One of the younger men shifted his weight, and Decker looked at him, and he went still. There's more, Decker said. He reached past Cassian and scrolled down in the file. The asset development notation has a cross-reference. He clicked through to the cross-reference document. It was a communication log. Internal Meridian Atlantic correspondence dated 14 months ago. 3 parties to the exchange, identified by code designations except for one, who had apparently not been careful enough about their own operational security because their name appeared twice in plain text in the body of the exchange. The name was Elena Marlowe. She felt the cold move through her before she understood why. And then she read the message text and she understood why. The message, sent 14 months ago from Vincent Voss's private encrypted address to two other parties, read, Marlowe's daughter is currently enrolled at the University of Chicago and presents a viable secondary leverage mechanism. Recommend we monitor for potential activation. She has no apparent awareness of her father's activities, but her proximity to academic networks with federal grant relationships makes her additionally useful. Secondary leverage mechanism. She sat very still. They were watching me, she said. Not with heat. With a flat precision that was more frightening than heat. Before your men came through my door, they were already watching me. For at least 14 months, Decker said. Which means, she said, working it through, my abduction wasn't purely reactive. Someone, your uncle, may have seen an opportunity when your brother died to activate the contingency. She looked at Cassian. He may have suggested to you, or created conditions for you to conclude, that taking me was the right tactical move. Cassian's expression did not change, but his breathing changed. She heard it, the controlled slow exhale of a man managing something that wants to be unmanageable. There was a conversation, he said, 3 days before the operation. Vincent said to me, he stopped, started again. He told me that Marlowe's daughter was in the city. He said it as information. He said he'd heard it through channels. He said it was worth knowing. He planted the idea. He planted the idea. Elena looked at her hands. Her father's voice was still in her ear, careful, calculating, giving Cassian exactly what he needed, because Marcus Marlowe understood, finally, that the threat was larger than either of them, and that the man who had burned his empire was now the only person with both the capacity and the motivation to do anything about it. She understood that her father had made a calculation. She understood the calculation was probably correct. She also understood that her father had not asked about her once during the 19 minutes he talked to Cassian Voss, and that this was also information, and that some information you carry without letting it touch you because the alternative is losing the use of yourself. What do we do with the files? She said. We can't move through legal channels without triggering Meridian Atlantic's political protection layer, Cassian said. The moment we approach a federal agency, we have to assume there are people inside it who will warn the network. Your father said the same. He looked at Decker. We need someone inside the federal structure who is demonstrably clean, someone whose record shows no contact with the Meridian political infrastructure. That's a narrow list, Decker said. Then we build a narrow list and we verify every name on it. Cassian started to push himself up from the table, and the wound made itself known, and he stopped, jaw tight, and then stood anyway. And in the meantime, we need Vincent to believe everything is still normal. We need him to believe I'm exactly where he expects me to be, grieving, distracted, prosecuting the war with Marlowe. He'll reach out, Decker said. He reaches out every day. Then I'll answer, the same way I always answer. He looked at Decker steadily. Can you do this? Decker's face was doing nothing, which with Decker meant he was doing a great deal. He had known Vincent Voss for 22 years. He had attended Vincent Voss's 62nd birthday dinner 14 months ago, and had eaten the man's food and drunk the man's wine and talked about the Cubs, which was something he actually cared about. And Vincent Voss had asked about his daughter who was finishing nursing school and had remembered her name. I can do it, he said. Joan. They worked through the night. Elena sat with the files and organized them with the particular systematic attention she had developed over years of academic research, creating an index, identifying primary and secondary sources, mapping the network structure the way she mapped an altarpiece's underdrawing, looking for the original compositional logic beneath the layers of overpainting. By 2 a.m, she had built a document that cross-referenced the financial records against the communication logs, and produced a clean timeline of Meridian Atlantic's Chicago operation going back 9 years. Cassian worked the phones. He talked to contacts she couldn't identify, and occasionally she heard his voice through the wall, controlled, professional, performing the version of himself that Vincent Voss expected. And she found herself tracking the sound of it for the specific moment when something underneath it might crack, which it never did. And she wasn't certain whether that was admirable or alarming. At 3 a.m., one of the younger men brought her coffee, and she drank it and didn't look up from the files. At 4:15 a.m., Cassian came back in and sat down across from her and looked at the document she had built on the laptop. "This is good," he said. "It's a start. The problem is the Port Authority records. There are 6 months missing from the manifest records, the ones that would directly connect the cargo movement to the human trafficking. Without those 6 months, the financial records are damning but arguable. A good defense attorney turns it into a complicated financial fraud case and keeps the trafficking charge out of it. Where are the missing records? According to the file structure your father's people sent, they were held by a logistics auditor named Garrison, an independent contractor who did compliance work for 3 of the port authorities. He found the discrepancies and started keeping copies." She paused. "He died in a car accident 11 months ago." "Copies," Cassian said. "People who keep copies keep them somewhere. His estate would have been handled by someone, so family, attorney." Cassian looked at the ceiling briefly. "Find the estate records. Find who handled it. We need someone on that by morning." Elena nodded. She turned back to the screen, and then something in the file she had opened caught her eye. A cross-reference she hadn't followed yet. A notation in the communication logs that pointed to a subfolder she'd skimmed past earlier. She clicked through. It was a personnel file, like the one on Vincent Voss, but newer. The date stamp was 8 weeks ago. The photograph was of a woman in her late 30s, professional headshot, the kind used for institutional identification. The name below it was one she recognized from the document Cassian's team had been building on clean federal contacts. An FBI task force supervisor named Reeves, who had come up twice as a possible approach vector. The designation on the file read, "Compromised. Do not approach." Elena stared at it. Then she scrolled down to the compromise details. Reeves had a daughter, 14 years old. The compromise file contained a photograph of the daughter. Not threatening, not explicit, just a photograph of a child on what appeared to be a school campus, taken from a distance with a long lens. The message was self-explanatory. Elena looked up. "Cassian." He looked over. "Your federal contact, Reeves. She's been compromised." She turned the laptop toward him. "They have her daughter." Cassian looked at the screen. His face was closed. She was the strongest option on the list. She may still be the strongest option, depending on what she wants more than she fears. Elena looked at him. People who are being coerced don't stop wanting to do the right thing. They just need the coercion removed. We can't remove the coercion without approaching her, and approaching her means she might report the contact to the wrong people. Or she might not, if we approach her the right way. There's no safe way to approach a compromised federal agent. There's no fully safe way to do anything we're currently doing. She held his gaze. But if we want legal prosecution, if we want the network dismantled in a way that actually holds, that doesn't just get rebuilt in 2 years because we burned the physical infrastructure the way you burned my father's, then we need someone inside with the authority to make it count. And she's the best option on the list, even with the complication. He looked at her for a long moment, then, "You're right." "I know. That doesn't make it less dangerous." Also true. Morning came through the industrial building's high windows in pale horizontal lines, and the compound's rhythm shifted into the particular texture of the hour between dark and full light when everyone is tired but no one can sleep because the work isn't done. Cassian had been on the phone with Vincent Voss at 6 a.m. She had heard it from the adjacent room, his voice, warm and purposeful, performing grief without difficulty because the grief was real, even if its target had just been relocated. He told his uncle the cartel attack had cost 3 men and significant material. He told his uncle the operation against Marlowe was yielding diminishing returns. He told his uncle he was reconsidering his approach and would want to sit down this week to talk strategy. Vincent Voss had said, "Of course, whatever you need, I'm here, the same as always." She had listened to Cassian say thank you and mean something entirely different by it, and understood that the man was more controlled than she had given him credit for. He came into her room after, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I need you to stay," he said. Not as a command, the way he'd asked about the phone, an actual question. I'm aware. That's not an answer. She looked at the files still open on the laptop, and at the coffee cup she'd been refilling for 6 hours, and at her own hands, which were steadier than she had a right to expect them to be. I'm staying, she said. Not because I don't have options, because this is the thing worth doing, and I'm the person in the room who can help do it. He nodded once. But I need something from you. He waited. When this is done, when the files go to Reeves, when the network is exposed, when the federal case is built, I need you to let my father go. She held his gaze steadily. Not immunity, not protection. Just not you. Whatever accountability he faces for his own business, he faces through legal channels. You don't finish the war. The war ends. Cassian looked at her for a long time. The light from the high windows was touching his face in a way that showed the exhaustion and the thing beneath the exhaustion, the thing that had been running underneath all of it from the beginning, the thing she hadn't named and wasn't going to name because naming it would change the weight distribution of everything they were doing. Agreed, he said. Say it like you mean it. The war ends. He said it with the same voice he used for operational instructions. Specific, final, the voice of a man who does not make commitments he doesn't intend to keep. I give you my word. She believed him, which was its own kind of information. The message from Decker came at 8:47 a.m. He came in with his phone, and his face had the quality she had learned to read as him managing information he didn't want to be managing, and he handed the phone to Cassian without explanation. Cassian read the screen. He read it twice. Elena watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do in 11 days. Not the controlled flatness, not the operative blankness, but an actual fracture, small and immediate. There and then locked down so hard it left a mark in the locking. He handed the phone to her. The message was from a number Decker had flagged as belonging to one of the 3 men running surveillance on Vincent Voss's residence. It said, in 8 words, he's gone. Took the files. Left 20 minutes ago. She looked up. He knew, Cassian said. His voice was very quiet. He knew we were running surveillance and he let us run it, and he took the 20 minutes he needed to access his own files and remove whatever implicated him most directly, and he is now... He stopped. How? Elena said. Cassian took the phone back. Because the man who runs our digital security has worked for my organization for 4 years and reported to my uncle's office for at least 2 of them. He was staring at the phone. He would have flagged our activity. He would have told Vincent the moment we started pulling his financial records. Then Vincent has known since we opened the laptop, yes. She sat with that. The cold moved through her again. The same cold as the night before. The kind the body produces not from temperature, but from the recalculation of risk. He let us work all night. He needed to know what we had. He needed to know how much Marlowe had given us. He let us build the picture, and then he took the original evidence, and now, the files we have are copies, Elena said. Your father's copies. They're real, but they're derivative. A defense team would attack the chain of custody. Yes. And the Garrison estate records, if Vincent has had 8 hours of warning, Garrison's estate records are gone. Cassian set the phone down. He stood very still in the middle of the room. We have a partial case. Suggestive, complex, defensible, by a competent attorney. We have lost the elements that made it unassailable. Not all of them. She stood up. Something had come together in her head. The particular feeling she got when the pieces of a restoration problem aligned, when the underdrawing and the painted surface and the analysis agreed with each other. The Port Manifest records, the missing 6 months that Garrison had. Those aren't in any of these files because your father's people never accessed them. They only knew Garrison had them. Vincent doesn't know about them either because Marlowe's people never told him, because Marlowe kept that element partitioned. Cassian looked at her. If Garrison kept copies, she said, and Vincent doesn't know to look for them, then they're still wherever Garrison left them. She looked at him. Where does a compliance auditor hide the most important documents he's ever found? Cassian was already thinking. She could see it. The way his mind worked when it was running clear rather than through grief and manipulation, the actual intelligence of the man stripped of the machinery of the organization. Not at home, he said, Not in any location that could be routinely accessed by the people he worked for. He stopped. His daughter. What? Garrison had a daughter. The estate documentation would name next of kin. He looked at Decker, who had been standing in the doorway. Find the daughter, today. Decker was already moving. Elena sat back down and looked at the files and thought about Garrison, a compliance auditor who had found something enormous and hidden it, and then died in a car accident that was certainly not an accident and had left whatever he'd hidden to whoever remained of him. And she thought about the weight of that, carrying something you knew would get you killed if the wrong people connected you to it, deciding to hide it rather than destroy it, which meant deciding that someday someone might need it. She thought about her own thesis, about the way restoration worked, the way you had to understand not just what the damage was, but what the original painter had intended, because without the original intention, the restoration was just a guess, and a guess on a Renaissance altarpiece was an act of vandalism dressed as preservation. She was not going to let this become vandalism dressed as justice. Her phone, the clean one Decker had given her, buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. The message said, "They know where you are. Moving now. Do not trust the man with gray in his beard." She read it twice and looked up, and Decker was in the doorway, and he had gray in his beard, and he was looking at his phone, and then he looked at her, and his expression shifted in a way that was very small and very fast, and she had just enough time to understand what the shift meant before he reached for the door. Decker's hand was on the door, and Elena was already moving. She didn't think it through. There was no time to think it through, and thinking it through would have produced the wrong answer anyway, because the correct answer was not rational. It was physical. It was the body's understanding that the door closing meant something irreversible. She crossed the 8 feet between her chair and the doorway in 3 steps, and hit the door with her shoulder before the latch caught, and the door came back into Decker's face, and she heard the impact and felt it travel up through her arm into the socket. And then she was past the door and in the corridor and running. Behind her, Decker said something she didn't hear clearly. Her own pulse was too loud. The industrial building's corridors were concrete, and everything echoed. And then she heard him moving, and she took the first turn she saw, because a straight line was a shooting gallery, and even if he wasn't going to shoot her right now in a hallway, she couldn't be certain enough of that to bet her life on it. She found Cassian in 40 seconds. He was in the main room with 2 of his men, looking at something on the table, and he looked up when she came through the door at speed, and something in his face sharpened immediately. Not alarm, but the kind of acute readiness that switches on in people who have spent years operating in environments where a person entering a room fast means the environment has changed. "Decker," she said, and held up the phone with the message still on the screen. He took it, read it. His face did the thing. The small fracture, locked down fast. Behind her, Decker appeared in the doorway. The 3 of them existed in the same room for 3 seconds. Decker was breathing harder than he should have been for the distance he'd covered. He looked at Cassian, and Cassian looked at him, and the 22 years between them were visible in that look. The weight of them, the accumulated texture of a relationship built on operational trust and shared history and countless rooms like this one, which made the moment more obscene than it would have been between strangers. Decker said, "It's not what it looks like." Cassian said, "Tell me what it looks like." "I got the message too, same number, 15 minutes ago." He didn't move from the doorway. His hands were visible, which was either the instinct of an innocent man or the calculation of a guilty one who understood the optics. "Whoever sent it to her sent it to me first. I was going to tell you." "The door," Elena said. Decker looked at her. "I was closing it because I didn't want people in the corridor hearing this conversation." Cassian was watching Decker's face with the attention of a man who has known another man long enough to read the text beneath the text. The silence stretched. 22 years, Cassian said. Not with anger. With something more difficult than anger. A provisional statement offered into open air. 22 years, Decker said. I did not know about Vincent. I did not know about any of it. A pause. But I understand why you can't take my word for that right now. No, Cassian said. I can't. He looked at the two men at the table, and something passed between them. A directive communicated without language, and one of them moved toward Decker with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. You'll stay here, under watch. Until this is finished. Decker didn't resist. He looked at Cassian for one more moment and nodded once, and that nod contained something that might have been understanding, or might have been grief, or was probably both simultaneously. And then he sat down at the table and put his hands flat on it and looked at the wall. The anonymous message's second function revealed itself 40 seconds later when Elena's phone buzzed again. Same number. 4 words. Garrison's daughter. Mercy Hospital. She showed Cassian. He read it and looked at her, and the calculation was visible on his face. Trust an anonymous source who had just been right once, move to a hospital which was either an actionable lead or an extremely efficient trap, do it while the compound's security integrity was uncertain and Vincent Voss was in the wind. It could be a pull, Elena said. Get us moving, get us in the open. It could be. He was already reaching for his jacket. But if Garrison's daughter is at Mercy Hospital and we don't move, and Vincent gets there first, we lose the manifest and we lose her. Yes. She was already standing. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as him calculating an argument he already knew he was going to lose. I'm going, she said. The source sent the message to me. Whatever they know my number specifically, which means this is at least partially about me being in the room. He didn't argue, which she was beginning to understand was its own form of respect. They moved with 4 men, a reduced team, fast and quiet, 2 vehicles. And Cassian drove the first vehicle himself because the 2 men who had served as his primary drivers were in the category of people whose loyalty now required reevaluation, and he drove the way she would have expected him to drive. Controlled, precise, fast without announcing itself as fast. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the city come alive around them. Chicago in the gray morning, the lake barely visible between buildings, pedestrians on sidewalks going about the ordinary business of ordinary lives in a city that contained within it, entirely invisible to them, a network that had been moving human beings through its port infrastructure for 11 years. And she felt the specific rage of someone who has been adjacent to power long enough to understand how thoroughly power conceals itself. When this is over, she said, not looking at him. Don't, he said. I'm not catastrophizing. I'm thinking ahead. Then think forward, not conditional. His eyes stayed on the road. Conditional thinking costs focus. She looked at his profile. Okay, forward. We get the manifest. We find a way to Reeves that doesn't trigger the compromise. We build the case. She paused. And your uncle? My uncle is the endgame. Without the evidence package complete, moving on Vincent produces nothing. He has resources and relationships that make a partial case disappear. He's running. He thinks he's running. Cassian's voice was very even. Vincent Voss does not know this city better than I do. He taught me everything he knows, which means I know everything he knows, and I know 3 things he's forgotten he taught me. He stopped. He will go to ground in one of 2 places. I know both of them. She looked at him. You're certain? I know how he thinks when he's afraid. He's afraid right now. Not of consequences. He's been managing consequences for years. He's afraid of me specifically. A brief pause. He should be, said. Mercy Hospital's East Wing visitor entrance was quiet at 9:20 in the morning, a Wednesday, the kind of midweek institutional calm that settles over large buildings when the crisis cases have stabilized and the administrative machinery is running. Elena went in through the main entrance while Cassian's men covered the exits. Cassian came in beside her because he had categorically refused to stay in the vehicle, and she hadn't tried twice to change his mind. They found the room from the admissions record. Cassian had a contact in the hospital's administrative system, a relationship that predated the current situation and had apparently never been evaluated for ethical complexity until right now. And the room was on the 4th floor, east corridor, and the woman in the bed was small and in her mid-30s and had her father's eyes, or what Elena imagined her father's eyes had looked like, the eyes of someone who understood numbers and patterns and had known for a long time that something was wrong with the numbers. Her name was Petra Garrison. She was recovering from a surgery that had nothing to do with any of this, an appendectomy, emergency, 2 days ago, and she looked at them when they came in with the specific look of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing what it was. "You're not doctors," she said. "No," Elena said. She pulled the chair up to the bedside and sat down, which was a deliberate choice. Same level, unthreatening, the posture of someone who needs rather than commands. "My name is Elena. This is Cassian. Your father worked as a compliance auditor for 3 Eastern Seaboard Port Authorities between 2018 and 2022. In late 2022, he found something in the manifest records that he kept copies of. We need those copies." Petra Garrison looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Cassian, who was standing near the window with his hands visible and his face as neutral as he could make it, which was fairly neutral. "My father died 11 months ago," she said. "We know. We're very sorry." Elena held her gaze. "We believe the accident was not an accident. We believe the people responsible are the same people who have been running a human trafficking network through the port infrastructure your father was auditing." Petra's face didn't do much. It was the face of someone who had already processed something. Not the grief that was present and layered, but the specific knowledge that the grief had a source that wasn't random. "He told me to keep them," she said. "He called me in October 2022, and he said if anything happened to him, there was an envelope in his safety deposit box at the bank on Elm Street, and I should keep it somewhere no one would look, and I should wait until the right people came asking." "What did the right people look like?" Cassian said from the window. His voice was quiet. Petra looked at him. "He said they'd be in trouble. He said people who aren't in trouble don't need what he had." She looked back at Elena. "You look like you're in trouble." "Considerable," Elena said. Petra reached toward the bedside table, slow, careful, the movement of someone with a fresh surgical sight, and opened the drawer and took out a phone. She unlocked it. She turned it toward Elena, and Cassian could see from where he stood that the screen showed a photograph of a sealed envelope. "I photographed everything before I put it away," Petra said. "After my father died, I went to the bank, and I opened the box, and I photographed every page and uploaded it to a private cloud account, and then I put the originals back and left them there." She looked at Elena. "My father spent 30 years being precise about everything. I was not going to be the thing that lost what he'd saved." Elena put her hand briefly over Petra's hand. "Can you share the account access with us?" "I already sent it," Petra said, 20 minutes ago, to a phone number I found in my father's notes. He had it written down with a notation that said, 'Use this number if the right people come.' I sent everything." She paused. "I also sent it to a journalist at the Tribune. My father's notation included a journalist's name. I sent it to her this morning." The room went very quiet. Cassian moved from the window to the foot of the bed in 3 steps and looked at Petra Garrison with an intensity she absorbed without flinching. "Which journalist?" "Her name is Park. Sarah Park." Elena looked at Cassian. Cassian's face had done the calculation before she'd finished looking at him. "If the files are with a journalist," Elena started, "then the evidence is no longer exclusively in our hands," he said, "which means Vincent can't suppress it by suppressing us." Something moved through his expression that was complicated and wasn't relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. "Your father was more careful than anyone knew." Petra Garrison said, "He was the most careful man I've ever met. He just couldn't be careful enough." She looked at her phone. "Are you going to be able to stop them?" "Yes," Cassian said, not with hesitation, not as performance. The flat certainty of a man stating an operational intention. "I'm going to stop them." "What?" They were back in his vehicles in 11 minutes, and Cassian was on the phone before the door was fully closed, and the call lasted 4 minutes, and she heard enough of it to understand that he was talking to someone in the journalist circle, a contact, a verifier, someone who could confirm that Sarah Park had received the files and had them secure. When the call ended, he looked at his phone for a moment. "Park has the files," he said. "She's been investigating Meridian Atlantic independently for 7 months. She has her own corroborating material. She's been waiting for the manifest records to make the piece publishable." "How long until she publishes?" "She's holding for 72 hours. She'll give us 72 hours to make the federal case." He looked at Elena. "After that, it goes public regardless. Then we have 72 hours to get to Reeves. And to get to Vincent." His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and something happened in his face, a brief, controlled reaction she had learned to read as significant. He turned the phone. The message was from an unknown number. It contained a photograph. The photograph showed Elena, not a current photograph. It was from her apartment, the apartment in Wicker Park, taken from outside the building through the window during what appeared to be evening. She was at her kitchen table with a book. It was taken before the abduction. It was a surveillance photograph, and it had been taken at a distance that required a long lens. Below the photograph, the message read, "Trade the files for the girl. You have 6 hours. Come alone to the Millhaven facility. You know where it is." Elena looked at the photograph of herself in her apartment, the version of herself who had been completely unaware, reading a book in the warm light of an ordinary evening, not knowing that she had been observed, catalogued, designated as a leverage mechanism. And she felt something move through her that was not fear exactly, but was the emotion that lives in fear's neighborhood, the one that arrives when you understand how long you've been in someone's crosshairs without knowing it. "He doesn't know the files are with the journalist," she said. "No." Cassian was looking at the message. "He thinks the Garrison files are still theoretical. He thinks the only copies we have are your father's derivative copies." He paused. "He thinks this trade has value." "Does he know where I am right now?" Cassian looked out the window. A surveillance camera on the corner they were approaching, another on the hospital's exterior, a city full of eyes that fed into systems that could be accessed by people with the right connections. "He probably has a reasonable guess," he said. "Then the offer is also a threat. If you don't come alone, he has enough information about our location to—" "Yes," he cut her off. Not rudely. The way you cut off a sentence when completing it would cost something unnecessary. She looked at him. "You're not going to trade me?" "No." "And you're not going to go alone?" "No." He was already texting, one-handed, eyes moving between the phone and the road. "But I'm going to the Millhaven facility, because that's where Vincent is, and because this is where this ends." "With what?" "He thinks you're coming to negotiate." "He knows I'm not coming to negotiate." He set the phone down. His jaw was set, and his eyes were on the road, and he looked, in that moment, stripped down to something essential. The version of a man that exists below all the organizational apparatus and the performed control and the careful management of how violence gets distributed. "Vincent knows me better than anyone alive, which means he knows I'm not capable of trading you. He sent the message because he wanted me in motion. He wants to see me coming." His voice was very quiet. "He's afraid to come to me, because he doesn't control the terrain here. He hasn't controlled anything since we opened those files. He's running, but he can't keep running. He has political relationships that require his physical presence to maintain, and every hour he's dark, those relationships are cooling. He needs this resolved." He glanced at her. "He needs me to either capitulate or be removed. The message is the opening of that conversation." "It's a trap," she said flatly. "Of course it's a trap." Something crossed his face. "I've known Vincent Voss for 36 years. If I can't walk into a trap of his making and walk back out, I don't deserve to walk back out." The Millhaven facility was a decommissioned cold storage and refrigeration plant in the city's old meatpacking district. 8 acres of insulated steel buildings, loading docks, refrigeration infrastructure that no longer ran, and the specific acoustic quality of large empty spaces designed to prevent heat transfer, which was also effective at preventing sound travel. The Voss organization had used it twice in the previous decade for operations that required isolation. Cassian had been inside it 4 times. He had helped to design the internal security modifications on the primary building. He knew every entry point and every failure in the system he'd had installed 8 years ago. He told Elena this on the drive over. He told it to her the way he briefed his men, specifically, without drama, focused on what was actionable. She listened and memorized because memorizing was what she did. They came in from 3 directions: himself and Elena through the southwest approach, his 2 men through the north loading dock, and 2 additional men he'd pulled from a secondary contact through the east perimeter. 6 people against whatever Vincent had brought, which his surveillance drone, a small civilian unit, the kind you bought at an electronics store and modified, put at 8 armed men distributed through the main building's interior. 8 against 6 in terrain Cassian knew better than Vincent did. with the element of Vincent's certainty that Cassian was coming alone working against Vincent rather than for him. The southwest approach took them through a service corridor that still smelled of decades of refrigeration chemicals, cold and chemical, and the particular damp of insulated spaces. And Elena was directly behind him, her hand on his jacket, moving in the sequence he had shown her without being told to rehearse it. She moved quietly. He hadn't expected that, and then had recalculated and expected it. The first of Vincent's men was positioned at the corridor's midpoint, facing the wrong direction, toward the main floor rather than the approach. And Cassian covered the distance between them in 4 seconds, and the man was down before he'd completed his turn. Elena did not make a sound. They came through onto the main floor from the service corridor's east exit, and the space opened up around them. A vast refrigeration hall, 60 feet across, with steel beams overhead, and the remains of industrial refrigeration tracks running along the ceiling, the cold storage chambers along the far wall still sealed, the overhead lighting system dead except for what the emergency strip lighting provided, which was a dim orange-yellow that turned everything the color of old photographs. Cassian saw Vincent Voss across the floor. His uncle was standing near the central loading area, not hiding, not in cover, standing in the open in the particular way of a man who has calculated that the psychological impact of being visible outweighs the tactical advantage of concealment. He was wearing a dark coat. His silver hair was precise. He looked, in the orange light, exactly like the man who had taught Cassian to drive and attended his mother's funeral and said, "Whatever you need, I'm here, the same as always at 6 o'clock that morning." And Cassian felt the specific cold of that recognition move through him and then processed it and continued moving. His 2 men came through the north dock simultaneously, and he heard the sounds of contact from the east perimeter that told him his additional 2 were engaging. Vincent watched him cross the floor. "Alone," Vincent said. "I asked for alone." "I know." Cassian stopped 20 feet out. His weapon was in his hand. His wound was making itself known with the particular insistence of injuries that have been asked to do more than they're currently capable of. A hot pressure below his ribs that he was managing through the straightforward mechanism of refusing to acknowledge it. "Where is she?" Vincent's expression shifted. Something between calculation and a genuine emotion that Cassian couldn't fully read. "She's here." "Show me." Cassian. His uncle's voice had its usual quality, warm, measured, the voice of someone who had spent decades being the most reasonable person in any room. "This doesn't have to be. Show me where she is." "She's unharmed. She's in one of the cold storage chambers, which are not currently cold, so don't—" "Which chamber?" Vincent looked at him for a moment with the look of someone revising an expectation. 3. On the left. He paused. "The combination is the date of your mother's birthday. I thought you'd appreciate that." Cassian looked at him for 3 full seconds. "You thought I'd appreciate that." "I thought it would remind you that some things are worth more than—" "You killed Daniel," Cassian said. Not loud, not with any of the rage that was present underneath the words. Just the words, flat and final, placed in the air between them. "You had my brother killed, and you used our mother's birthday as a combination on the chamber where you're keeping a woman you've been using as a pawn since before I knew her name." Vincent was quiet. "You have a gift," Cassian said, "for sentiment. You've always used it as a weapon. You taught me that, actually. You said, I remember exactly. I was 22 and we were sitting in your kitchen. You said the most powerful leverage you'll ever find is what someone loves. You find what they love and you hold it, and they will do anything." He stopped. "You found what I loved. Twice. You used Daniel, and then when Daniel was gone, you used her." He took 1 step forward. "Tell me where your men are." "Cassian, your men are down. All of them. This is over, Vincent." He stopped 5 feet out. The weapon was level. "Tell me where your men are, and then you and I are going to walk out of this building together, and you're going to answer every question an FBI task force supervisor named Reeves asks you for as long as she wants to ask them. Because Reeves is not compromised anymore. We moved her daughter to a safe location 40 minutes ago, which I arranged while you were watching my approach, and feeling confident about the trap you'd set. He watched his uncle's face. The manifest files are with the journalist and with the federal system, and you have no more moves. Vincent Voss stood in the orange light, and the warm, reasonable face went through several things in rapid succession: calculation, recalculation, the specific look of a man discovering that the terrain he thought he controlled has been regraded beneath his feet. And then it settled into something more honest than anything Elena had seen on it in any photograph. "You were always better than me," Vincent said. And meant it, which was the worst thing he'd said yet. Cassian didn't answer. From across the floor, from the direction of the third cold storage chamber, came the sound of a fist hitting a steel door 3 times, steady and deliberate. And Cassian turned his head toward it without lowering the weapon, and then Vincent moved. He moved faster than a man his age should have moved, and he moved toward the emergency panel on the wall behind him. The refrigeration system's manual override, which Cassian had designed and installed 8 years ago, and which he recognized 1/4 of a second too late. And his hand hit the switch, and the lights went out completely, and the refrigeration system came on with a sound like the building inhaling. And in the sudden total darkness, with the cold beginning to pour from the chamber vents, Cassian heard his uncle's footsteps, and had 3 seconds to decide how this was going to end before the man was gone. He fired once at the sound. He heard the impact. He heard his uncle go down. Then he crossed the floor in the dark toward the third chamber, hand on the wall, counting steps, weapon forward, because Elena was in that room, and the cold was coming, and everything else could wait. The darkness in the Millhaven facility was total. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn or a hallway with failed lighting. This was industrial darkness. The darkness of a building designed to seal out heat and light, and every variable that might compromise refrigeration integrity, and it pressed against Cassian's eyes with the physical weight of complete absence. He moved by memory, left hand on the wall, weapon forward in the right, counting steps the way his uncle had once taught him to count steps in darkness, not by feel but by the internal map you build in the light and carry into the dark, trusting it, because the alternative is standing still, and standing still was not an option. 17 steps from the emergency panel to the third chamber corridor. He counted. Behind him, somewhere in the main hall, he could hear his men moving, flashlight beams cutting across the dark, voices low and controlled, the sounds of the situation being managed by people who knew their jobs. He heard one of them call Vincent's name and heard no answer, which told him his uncle was either unconscious or worse, and either way was no longer the immediate variable. 11. 12. The refrigeration system was pumping cold air through vents that ran along the ceiling. Not at full capacity, the system hadn't run in months and was cycling up from 0, but the air temperature had already dropped 4 degrees in the 30 seconds since Vincent had hit the switch, and it was going to keep dropping. The chambers themselves had independent insulation. If Elena was inside Chamber 3 and the seals were intact, the cold would reach her more slowly. If the seals weren't intact, or if Vincent had opened the chamber's internal venting before he'd staged her there, then the timeline was considerably shorter, 17 steps. His left hand found the chamber door, steel, heavy, the industrial refrigeration-grade construction that he had specified 8 years ago without ever imagining he would be on the wrong side of it. The combination lock was a dial, the old mechanical kind, and he found it in the dark by touch and spun it to his mother's birthday. Month, day, year, the same combination he would have chosen if he were the one who needed something remembered. And the lock released, and he pulled the chamber door, and it came open on its weighted hinges, and the cold from inside hit him like a wall. Not lethal cold, not yet. The chamber had been ambient for months, and the refrigeration override had been running for 90 seconds, and physics required a margin of time before stone cold became dangerous. Cold. But the air coming out of the chamber was well below the main facility's temperature, and it carried the smell of industrial refrigerant and old meat and time. Elena. He heard movement before he heard her voice, the sound of someone getting to their feet from a floor, the scrape of a boot on concrete. Here! Her voice was even, controlled the way it had been on the first morning in the stone room, the way it was in every moment he had watched her navigate the impossible without surrendering to it. I'm not restrained. They put me in and locked it and left. I've been standing against the far wall because the vents are on the left. Smart. Basic thermodynamics. A pause. Your uncle. Down. Dead. I don't know yet. He found her arm in the dark and she grabbed his forearm at the same moment, the grip immediate and specific. Can you move fast? Yes. She was already moving with him toward the door. Her hand was cold against his jacket. Not the deep tissue cold of someone in early hypothermia, but the surface cold of someone who had been in a refrigerated space for less than an hour, which meant he had the margin he'd calculated. They came back through the door into the main hall as the flashlight beams found them, and one of his men had a coat, stripped from one of Vincent's people, dark, tactical nylon, and wrapped it around Elena's shoulders without being asked, which told Cassian something about the kind of men he'd built his operation with despite everything, that in a facility where everything had just gone wrong, one of his men's first instincts was to find a coat. Vincent Voss was on the floor near the emergency panel. He was alive. The shot had taken him in the right shoulder. Clean entry. The exit was messier, but the structural damage was muscular rather than organ-adjacent, and he was conscious and sitting with his back against the wall when the flashlights found him, one hand pressed against his shoulder, and his face doing a controlled management of pain that, even now, Cassian recognized as a taught behavior. He had taught Cassian the same control, the same year he'd taught him to count steps in darkness. His uncle looked up at him through the flashlight beams and said nothing. Cassian crouched down to his level. He looked at the wound briefly, assessed it with the eye of someone who had seen enough of them to categorize it accurately, and then looked at his uncle's face. "It's through," he said. "You'll keep the arm." Vincent said, "You always aimed for the extremities." "You taught me that too." "I taught you most things." "Yes." Cassian held his uncle's gaze in the fractured light. "You did." They secured the facility and called the ambulance that Elena had already been on the phone for arranging from the moment the lights came back on. His men had restored the emergency lighting within 4 minutes, which was 40 seconds faster than the design spec Cassian had established. And he noted that without particular satisfaction, because the metric of the operation's success had nothing to do with lighting restoration speed. Vincent's 8 men were secured and accounted for. 3 of Cassian's men had sustained injuries, 2 minor, 1 that required the ambulance as much as Vincent did. FBI Task Force Supervisor Reeves arrived 22 minutes after the ambulance. She was in her late 30s and looked like someone who had been running on insufficient sleep for at least 2 weeks. Not diminished by it, but sharpened in the particular way that exhaustion sharpens some people, burning away everything non-essential and leaving a very clean cutting edge. She came in with 4 agents, and she looked around the facility with the eyes of someone who was already building the legal structure in her head, noting what was present and what its evidentiary status was. And then she looked at Cassian. "Your people moved my daughter at 4 this morning," she said. "Yes." "She's safe. She's with 2 people I trust in a hotel on the north side. You can have her location the moment you want it." Reeves looked at him for a long moment. She had a face that was very good at not performing what it was doing internally, which was a quality Cassian recognized and respected. "You know I'm going to have to take you into custody." "I know, and you're prepared for that. I have spent the last 72 hours building a case that requires my testimony to be complete. I am prepared to give that testimony in full, under oath, and to cooperate with every aspect of this investigation for as long as it takes." He held her gaze. "In exchange for the prosecution of Meridian Atlantic and every connected party as the primary objective of this investigation, not the Voss organization, not Marcus Marlowe, Meridian Atlantic." Reeves looked at him for another moment, then she looked at Elena. Elena looked back at her steadily. "Your father," Reeves said to Elena. "My father will cooperate," Elena said. "He has material that corroborates the Garrison manifest from a different angle. Independent financial tracking of Meridian's payment structure. He will make it available." A pause. "He is requesting consideration for his cooperation. He's not getting immunity. He's not asking for immunity. He's asking for consideration. There's a difference." Elena's voice was level. "He understands the difference." Reeves nodded once, the nod of someone filing a position without endorsing it. She looked back at Cassian. "There's going to be a period of... This is going to be complicated. The legal structure of this is going to be complicated." "I know." "You're going to serve time." I know that too. She studied him. Most people in your position would be making other choices right now. Most people in my position, he said, haven't spent the last 11 days being shown what those other choices actually cost. He didn't look at Elena when he said it, but the sentence had a direction to it. Reeves produced handcuffs from her belt with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom this was a procedural act rather than a symbolic one. She held them for a moment. Your men. Will stand down, fully. He looked at the men around him, his men, the ones who had moved through the facility with him, who had been with him since before this began. And they looked back at him, and the thing that moved between them was not sentiment, but the specific understanding of people who have operated together long enough to communicate through posture and eye contact and the way a man holds his shoulders. This is how it ends, he told them. All the way, no half measures. Whatever Agent Reeves asks, you give it. Not one of them objected. He held his wrists out. Reeves put the cuffs on. Elena watched him be walked out of the Millhaven facility in handcuffs in the gray morning light, and she stood in the doorway of the decommissioned plant and tracked the line of his back until the federal vehicle closed around him and pulled away. And then she stood there a while longer in the coat that smelled of someone else's tactical gear, and she breathed the cold morning air that smelled of the lake and old industry and the specific aftermath of things that have been resolved. She pulled out the phone Decker had given her, and she called a number and it rang twice. Her father answered on the second ring, careful and alert, the same as always. It's done, she said. A pause. Are you hurt? No. Elena, don't. She kept her voice even. Not with coldness, she had spent too much of the last 11 days using energy on coldness to have any left for a purely emotional deployment of it. I need you to call Reeves. Her number is going to come through on a text in the next 5 minutes. I need you to call her and tell her everything you told Cassian and give her everything in the dead drop files and cooperate completely and not strategize about it. Just cooperate. A pause. Can you do that? Another pause. Longer. Yes. Good. She started to end the call and then stopped. He kept his word. Cassian. He gave me his word the war with you was done, and he kept it even when it cost him to keep it. She let that sit in the air for a moment. I wanted you to know that, because I don't think you expected it. She ended the call before he could respond. Dient. Decker was cleared. It took 11 days, during which he sat in the room where Cassian had left him with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is the only language available to him and has committed to it completely. The federal review of his communications and financial records found no evidence of connection to Meridian Atlantic, no evidence of any contact with Vincent Voss beyond the normal operational communications of men who worked in the same organization, and no evidence of foreknowledge of any element of the conspiracy. He was released on a Thursday morning, and he sat in his car in the federal building's parking structure for 12 minutes before he started the engine. And in those 12 minutes, he did something that he would not have described to anyone if asked, because he was not a man who described the interior of himself, and also because grief of that particular kind, for a version of the world that turned out to be wrong without the wrongness being anyone's deliberate choice, doesn't fit in language that he trusted. Then he started the engine and drove to the hotel where Elena had been staying, and he brought coffee, because he was a man who expressed things through logistics, and he sat across from her at the small table near the window, and they drank the coffee and looked at the city for a while. He said you'd come, Elena said. Did he? Before the facility. He said if anything happened, Decker would come to wherever I was. She looked at her coffee cup. He said you were the most reliable person he'd ever known. Decker said nothing. He drank his coffee. I think that might be the most personal thing I've heard him say about anyone, she said. Decker put his cup down. He doesn't have a lot of practice with personal. He looked out the window. His father wasn't a demonstrative man, and his uncle spent 30 years teaching him that sentiment was leverage to be managed rather than something you allowed yourself. He paused. He spent his whole life being good at things that required him not to be a person. Being a person required practice he never got. Elena looked at him. And now? Decker picked up his coffee. Now he's got time. The trial took 14 months during which the federal investigation dismantled Meridian Atlantic Holdings from its financial infrastructure outward, following the threads that the Garrison Manifest provided: the Port Authority relationships, the political connections, the shell company architecture that had protected the network's cargo for 11 years. Following those threads led to 18 additional individuals across 5 states and 2 federal agencies, and the prosecution of those individuals produced testimony that led to 7 more. And the whole thing had the particular quality of a structure whose load-bearing walls have been correctly identified and removed, where the collapse is not dramatic, but it is comprehensive. Sarah Park's piece ran in the Tribune 6 weeks after the Millhaven facility operation, and it ran with the specificity and documentation that turns journalism into record, not allegation, not suggestion, but the particular weight of verified fact laid out in sufficient detail that denial became structurally impossible. The piece ran in 4 parts over 3 weeks, and each part produced the kind of public and institutional response that investigations require to maintain momentum, which Park had clearly understood when she staged the release, because Garrison's daughter had told her about the staging, and Petra Garrison's father had been a man who understood timing. Petra Garrison attended every day of the primary trial. She sat in the gallery in the same seat, and she brought a thermos of coffee, and she watched with the quiet attention of someone who has waited 11 months for something and intends to be present for every minute of it. On the day that the lead Meridian Atlantic defendant was convicted on all counts, she sat still for a moment after the verdict was read, and then she closed her thermos and put it in her bag and left without speaking to anyone, which was not coldness, but completion. Vincent Voss pled guilty on 43 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder for his role in Daniel's death, as part of an agreement that required his complete cooperation and testimony against the Meridian Atlantic Network. The cooperation was extensive and the testimony was precise. He had built the network's Chicago infrastructure, and he knew where every element was buried, and he gave it all, not because he felt remorse, but because he was a man who understood calculation and had calculated that this was the only move remaining. The remorse was a separate question that Cassian spent a long time not asking himself because he was not ready for whatever the honest answer was. Marcus Marlowe received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. 14 months served at a minimum security facility in Wisconsin. He was released 18 months after Elena had made the phone call from the industrial building, and he sent her a letter from Wisconsin 3 months before his release. Careful, precise, 3 sentences long. The first sentence asked if she was well. The second said he thought about the phone call often. The third said he understood if she didn't write back. She thought about it for 11 days. Then she wrote back. 4 sentences. The last one said she wasn't ready for more than this yet, but she wanted him to know she had received the letter. She signed it with her name, not a closing, because a closing implied a relationship with an established emotional register, and she wasn't there yet, and she was not going to perform being there. She mailed it on a Wednesday morning on her way to the university, where she had returned to her thesis 3 months after the Millhaven operation, having contacted her advisor with an explanation that was factually accurate and strategically incomplete, in which her advisor, a 70-year-old woman who had survived 3 decades in academia and was not easily unsettled, had received with the single response, "I'm glad you're alive. Come in on Monday." She finished the thesis in April. The conclusion argued that restoration's fundamental ethic was not the elimination of damage, but its honest integration, that a restored work which pretended to be undamaged was a forgery of itself, while a restoration that acknowledged damage while revealing original intent was the only form that deserved the name. She had written the argument before any of this had happened, had been 6 weeks from finishing it when the men had come through her door, and she returned to it after and found that it had not changed, but that she had, and that the argument meant something different now, because she was reading it as a person who had sustained damage of her own and was in the process of deciding what to integrate and what to carry. She defended it in June. She passed. Cassian was released on a Tuesday morning in October, 22 months after his arrest. He had testified for a combined total of 61 days across 4 separate proceedings. He had provided financial records, communication logs, operational documentation, and personal testimony that had contributed materially to the conviction of 26 individuals. He had answered every question asked of him without qualification or strategic omission, which his attorney had repeatedly told him was not how this was done. And he had looked at his attorney each time and said he understood that and intended to do it anyway. He walked out of the federal facility in the clothes he'd gone in wearing, not a symbolic choice, just the only clothes he had there. And the morning air was cold in the particular way of early Chicago October, the lake wind coming off the water with an authority that felt personal, and he stood in it for a moment and breathed. There was no car waiting. He had not told anyone the exact release date because he wanted the first minutes of it to belong to no one but himself, to be a space that had not been arranged or managed. And this was unusual for a man who had spent his adult life inside a structure that arranged and managed everything, but it was the right instinct, and he trusted it. He walked 4 blocks to a coffee shop and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and a sandwich, and ate both of them slowly while watching the street through the window. And no one in the coffee shop knew who he was, which was a condition he had never previously occupied in this city, and which felt, if not exactly like freedom, then like the antechamber of something that freedom might eventually inhabit. His phone, a new phone, the number known to very few people, buzzed once. The message was from Elena. It said, "There's a gallery on Wabash showing Flemish Renaissance prints through November. I thought you might want to know. No pressure." He looked at the message for a moment. He left the coffee shop. He walked south on Michigan and then west on Adams and then south on Wabash. And the city moved around him in the ordinary way of cities that do not know what has happened inside them. And he walked through it with no protection and no apparatus and no managed perimeter, just a man in October clothes on a city sidewalk with coffee wearing off and a specific destination, and it felt not good exactly, not yet, but true, which was different from good and in some ways more durable. The gallery was small, second floor of an older building, the kind of space that had been a professional office in a previous life, and still had the bones of it under the white walls and track lighting. The prints were mounted in simple frames, and the room had maybe 12 people in it, spread across the space in the particular dispersed way of gallery visitors who are looking at things and thinking privately. Elena was standing in front of a large print in the far corner. He knew her before he'd fully registered her. The dark hair, the particular quality of her stillness when she was looking at something carefully, the way she held her arms crossed in front of her with her weight on one foot, the same way she had stood in the stone room on the first morning when he had come in without knocking, and she had looked at him with those eyes that didn't perform anything. He crossed the gallery and stopped beside her. She looked at the print for a moment before she looked at him. The print was a reproduction of a Flemish triptych, a central panel and 2 wings, figures in detailed landscape, the kind of work where the longer you looked, the more you found. "You look terrible," she said. "I know. You also look like yourself." She turned to look at him fully, and whatever she found in his face satisfied some internal assessment because she held his gaze without the particular evaluative tension that had been present in even their most direct moments in the compound and the industrial building and the Mill Haven facility. "How does it feel?" "Strange." He looked at the print. "Quiet. I'm not sure I've ever been in a quiet situation before." "You'll get used to it. People keep saying that about things." She almost smiled. Not quite. Her smiles were not easy things. They had to be earned by something specific. But the architecture of the almost was visible and familiar, and he had earned it, he knew, not through any single act, but through the accumulated weight of 61 days of testimony, of choosing the road that cost more and took longer and didn't deliver anything dramatic at its end. Just a cold October morning and a coffee counter and a gallery on Wabash. "Decker found you a job," she said. He mentioned that. "Logistics consulting for a Port Authority compliance firm." She looked at the triptych. "He said you'd hate the actual work but would be good at it." Both of those things are probably true. The firm is actually doing legitimate work. Reeves vouched for the principals. She glanced at him. "It's in Chicago." "I know." A pause. Outside, the October wind moved against the building's windows. "My thesis is going to be published," she said. "Journal of Art Conservation, February issue. I'd like to read it. You'd find it dry. I spent 2 years running a criminal organization and 22 months in a federal facility. My threshold for acceptable reading has adjusted considerably." She did smile then. It arrived the way real smiles do on people who don't perform them. Not deployed, not constructed, just present. And it changed her face in the way that the things you don't perform always change a face, by showing something underneath the surface that the surface was not designed to contain. He stood beside her in the small gallery on Wabash and looked at the Flemish triptych, the central panel, the two wings, the figures in their detailed landscape going about the particular business of the particular moment the painter had chosen to preserve. And he thought about Daniel, which he did every day and intended to keep doing, not because the grief had not changed shape, but because grief that changes shape is still grief and deserves its acknowledgement. He thought about his uncle, who was serving a 30-year sentence in a federal facility in Indiana, who had called Cassian once through official channels and said, "I'm sorry," and then not called again because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't be self-serving, which was perhaps the most honest thing Vincent Voss had ever done. He thought about the men who had been moved through Meridian Atlantic's ports, not cargo, people, each with the full weight of what that meant. And he thought about Petra Garrison's father, who had understood what he had found and had hidden the evidence rather than destroyed it because he believed that someday someone who needed it would come asking. He thought about the moment in the darkness of the Mill Haven facility when he had fired at a sound and heard the impact and crossed the floor by memory to a locked steel door, and what it meant that the combination had been his mother's birthday, and whether his uncle had said it that way as cruelty or as something more complicated. The last gesture of a man who had genuinely loved the people he had also systematically destroyed. He didn't have an answer to that, and he was learning slowly that not every question of that kind required one. Some things you carried not because you understood them, but because setting them down was not available to you, and carrying them honestly was better than carrying them under a different name. "There's a small apartment," Elena said, without looking away from the print. "On the north side. A friend of mine is subletting it. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a window that faces east." She paused. "She said the landlord is tolerable, and the building is quiet, and the neighborhood has a good coffee shop on the corner." He looked at the side of her face. "I'm not saying it has to be anything," she said. "I'm saying there's an apartment on the north side, and it's available in 2 weeks, and you're currently sleeping on Decker's couch, which I know because he told me, with the specific expression of a man who is too loyal to complain and too honest not to mention it." Cassian was quiet for a moment. The gallery around them continued its quiet business. Other people, other prints, the ordinary drift of people looking at things and thinking privately. "The coffee shop," he said. "Good espresso. Reasonable hours. She says they know their regulars by name within the first week. That sounds..." He paused. "That sounds like a reasonable neighborhood." Elena finally turned and looked at him fully. And they stood that way in the gallery on Wabash on a cold October morning, 2 people who had met under conditions that should have made any subsequent version of each other impossible, who had instead found something in the worst circumstances that proved more load-bearing than either of them had anticipated. And the look that moved between them was not a declaration and not a transaction, but simply the particular recognition of 2 people who have been through the specific fire of truth and come out knowing each other's actual weight. "The apartment comes furnished," she said. "Mostly. There are some books." "I can bring books." "You don't have books? You were in federal custody for 22 months. "Then I'll buy books." He looked at her. "I have time now." She held his gaze for another moment and then turned back to the print, and he turned with her, and they stood side by side in front of the Flemish triptych and looked at the small, precise world the painter had made, the figures, the landscape, the light falling across it from a source that was outside the frame, but whose effects were present in everything. And the gallery around them was warm, and the city outside was cold and ordinary and enormous, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was a particular kind of silence that was not the absence of something, but its presence. And they had both learned, through considerable cost, the difference. Outside on Wabash, Chicago went about its business. The lake pushed wind between the buildings. A man at a coffee counter 2 blocks north was putting on his coat to leave for the day. Petra Garrison was driving home from a Tuesday that contained nothing remarkable. Marcus Marlowe was reading in a small apartment in Wisconsin, learning, at 71, what a quiet afternoon felt like. Decker was at a desk in a logistics office on the 14th floor, looking at a compliance document with the expression of a man who finds legitimate paperwork genuinely more complicated than anything he has previously done with his life, and who is glad of the complication. And in a gallery on Wabash, a man who had once been an empire stood in front of a painting beside the woman who had twice now refused to let him come apart, and understood, not as philosophy, not as lesson, but in the bone-deep way that only the things you have paid for entirely can be understood. That the distance between who he had been and who he intended to be was not a gap to be bridged, but a direction to be walked, one ordinary morning at a time, with no guarantee and no protection and no managed perimeter. Just honest work, quiet mornings, and the long, difficult, necessary practice of becoming a person. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.